Welcome back for our second panel on land, rent, and financialization. This panel will be moderated by Ara Awan. She's a PhD candidate in political science here at the University of Chicago, focusing on political theory and intellectual history. And her PhD dissertation examines Marxism and anti-colonial thought. She'll be moderating the discussion. Ara.
To the second panel of our conference today. I'm going to briefly introduce our three panelists, and then we'll move on to 20-minute presentations from all of them, and they'll be followed by 30 minutes of Q&A. So if you think of questions and thoughts, do jot them down during the presentations, and we'll get to them very soon. So starting from the right, we have Adrián de León Arias is a professor of economics at the University of Guadalajara. His recent research concerns the history of economic thought, American institutionalism, and the social and economic contributions of Thorstein Veblen. He will be delivering a paper titled Tracking Some Features of Neo-Feudalism in Thorstein Veblen's Analytical Contributions. Next, we have Jack Votava, who's a former economist and now graduate student at Northwestern University, Department of Sociology. Jack's research focuses on the history of capitalism and financialization, theories of money and banking, and archival work. He will be delivering a paper titled In Praise of Debt, Expectational Power and the Causes of Financial Crisis in Argentina. And last, we have James Tierney, who's an assistant professor of law at Chicago Kent College of Law, Illinois Tech, where he focuses on the law of capitalism and capital markets regulation. He has also taught at Nebraska Law and Rutgers Law and previously practiced at the SEC Office of General Counsel. Outside work, he organizes to reduce the coordination costs between anti-capitalist elected officials at the DSA Fund, for which he's a treasurer and a board member. He will be delivering a paper titled Financialized Farmland. So we'll now hear first from Jack Votava.
Hey, everyone. Thank you so much for being here. I'm really excited to share my paper project with you about financial crisis in Argentina. I think maybe the prudent place for me to start is to kind of locate my project within the larger neo-feudalism conversation, which is to say that in my understanding, the debates over labeling the contemporary mode of production rest in part on what we perceive to be the relationship between the financial sector, the quote-unquote real economy, and the state. And my own intended key intervention here is to characterize that relationship in what I see as an extreme context, that of Argentina, and in particular, to suggest a much greater emphasis on the state and the role of the state than is sometimes brought to bear in these conversations. And I mean not here simply the absence of a state, but kind of affirmative, active state action. So in December of 2001, Argentina experienced what is a relatively rare phenomenon for the post-war era: simultaneous banking crisis, currency crisis, and sovereign debt crisis. This financial polycrisis, which we might term a general liquidity crisis, was among the most intense of the modern era, with what was at the time the world's largest sovereign debt default, an extraordinary contraction in the real economy, with GDP falling by over 20%, unemployment reaching over 25%, and more than half of the population falling below the poverty line. For the last 20 years, even liberal economists have told a similar story about this crisis, as well as subsequent crises, which is that the financial crisis was essentially the result of government profligacy and the outcome of an unsustainable national debt. However, this causal story rings particularly hollow in the case of the Argentine crisis, which, as I shall show, occurred in the midst of unrelenting austerity measures, strict willingness to appease the market at all costs, and relatively modest growth and debt. In my project, I study the Argentine case as an illustrative or most extreme example to showcase what I understand to be the contemporary international political economy of money. In this talk, I specifically hope to convince you of the following points. First, that a central defining feature of the modern mode of production is the mode of creation of money and credit. Specifically, I follow Joseph Schumpeter in conceptualizing money markets as the headquarters of the capitalist system, which by extension implicates liquidity crises as a uniquely capitalist mode of crisis. Headquarters here, as a word we might think, is referring to the kind of governing or commanding position in the economy. Second, I will argue that stable liquid currency is not a natural or default state, but is the outcome of active intervention by political authority. Specifically, I draw upon Jens Beckert's notion of fictional expectations, which refers to as-if images that actors create to imagine future states of the world. The fictional part of these expectations are to emphasize that these as-if images aren't simple rational or irrational thoughts, but are here more akin to the one's basic categories of meaning, which precede and become the stuff of rationality. I argue that monetary governance is primarily concerned with the generation and contestation of these fictional expectations. Third, I argue that modern financialization has a contradictory or paradoxical tendency at its core, which is the contestation of state control over the money supply, while at the same time maintaining a deep reliance on centralized coordination of these fictional expectations. At the level of the empirical case, I thus argue that the devastating 2001 Argentine financial crisis was caused primarily by political crisis, which severely abrogated the capacities of the state to coordinate expectations. I characterize the political crisis in question as resulting from disastrous austerity, which sought to constrain the state according to an ideology of investor supremacy and debt limitations. My theoretical apparatus is largely grounded in a neo-chartalist conception of currency, meaning a conception which understands money in the first instance as a credit issued by the state against its future tax obligations. One powerful advantage to this framework is that it coheres remarkably well with careful historical work on the deep history of currency, which emphasizes its coevolution with structures of political sovereignty as a tool to organize behavior and collective projects. As such, I understand government money to be an obligation, a promise about the future, no matter whether the said currency is said to be made of metal or paper. Debt, on the other hand, is a promise to pay currency at a future date. And here I agree with scholars in the modern monetary theory tradition that there is no natural or financial limit to debt denominated in a sovereign's currency, since all such currency represents in the last instance is the state's promise to waive tax obligations in the future. But the crucial spin in capitalism is that modern banks of deposit generate currency through the bank's issuance of loans and credit, which answer to the sovereign's unit of account. Thus, modern states must simultaneously coordinate the legitimacy of government-issued money while also regulating and supporting the entire private institutional banking ecosystem. This conception of money implies that currency both depends upon and sets fictional expectations. For example, at a basic level, money commensurates social reality, telling participants that a quantity of X is equivalent to Y. The legitimacy of commensuration is a precondition for money's operation, while the enactment of exchange is an outcome of money use. Additionally, as famously argued by Hayek, an economy with money prices distributes information about the relative scarcity of goods, which helps construct and orient actors' images of the present and future. But the precondition of this pricing is the legibility of the specific unit of account in question. For example, if you tell me that a bag of chips is 0.0005 Bitcoin, this information is not meaningful to me. Finally, the very use of money by an actor suggests a relationship of belonging between an actor and a set political economic community. Thus, the existence of a currency can be a stand-in for the abstract idea of a nation or a people, which is further reinforced by the usual practice of branding coins and bills with the iconography of the sovereign. The relevant concept I want to suggest here is the concept of expectational power, which is conceptualized as a capacity to set and maintain these fictional expectations. In practical terms, the locus of expectational power in the political economy of money is the state. To exercise expectational power, the state participates in monetary creation via multi-layered sequential governance. In close homology to the concept of money itself I have introduced, I understand state creation of currency as both enacting and depending upon expectational power. In this way, political structure and monetary structure are inextricable and exist in self-reinforcing sequence. I understand expectations to consist of heterogeneous psychological components at the individual level, possibly including unconscious, preconscious, and non-conscious components. At the most basic level, money contains meaning as an unconscious or semi-conscious framework of commensuration, which helps set the boundaries of what it is possible for actors to imagine. I term this most basic level of expectations conceivable expectations, and understand it to correspond to what economics calls a unit of account, which is a purely abstract idea independent of any actual money instruments. At a practical level, the state teaches actors what it purports to be the meanings, usage, and origins of the money instruments it issues. Money users learn or contest these meanings, and when successful, integrate money usage into their unproblematic, frequent, routine behavior. In this way, money becomes naturalized or reified, embodied in actors' actions, as such actors' beliefs are no longer primarily the product of their mental will, but rather are shown in their habitual routines and actions. Finally, actors consciously project into the future and have considered judgments about whether a currency will continue to have value. To help buttress these projects and thereby maintain the present liquidity of currency, states enact a whole regulatory regime over the banking and financial system, such as by insuring bank deposits or implementing capital controls, to help actors rationally expect a future where a currency acts as a stable store of value. Thus, my basic model of liquidity crisis is an unwinding of this self-reinforcing cycle of currency, by which institutional conflict within the financial system begins to problematize everyday meanings of money for ordinary money users, and even call into question the basic framings of the political and economic order. Not surprisingly, this model is more or less how I characterize the Argentine financial crisis of 2001. And indeed, part of what motivates me to turn to this particular case and what makes it interesting and relevant is that the crisis here reaches down all the way to the level of conceivable expectations, or so I argue, where we can witness contestation at the level of the unit of account. In particular, at every point in this crisis, the eroding liquidity of the peso was entangled in both political and economic problems. At a highly simplified level, concern about capital outflows devaluing peso-denominated financial assets turned into bank runs, which turned into contestation of state money creation and ultimately contestation of the state's sovereignty itself. Before presenting my original evidence about the political economy of Argentine crisis, let me very briefly back up here and give some background on the case. In 1989, the democratically elected president Carlos Menem, despite hailing from the historically labor-oriented Peronist movement, betrayed the left flank of his party by undertaking a thorough regime of economic liberalization in Argentina, which he promised to make permanent and irreversible. The key instrument of Menem's sharp neoliberal swing was Domingo Cavallo, a Harvard-trained and IMF-friendly economist who headed the economy ministry both during the 1990s and again during the 2001 crisis. The centerpiece of Menem and Cavallo's efforts was the convertibility plan, which was fully implemented in 1991. Under the convertibility plan, Argentina migrated to a new currency, the peso, which was to have a fixed exchange rate with the dollar at a rate of $1 for 1 peso. For a time, this policy appeared successful in creating investment-led growth. During 1991 to 94, and again from 96 to 98, the Argentinian economy grew rapidly, driven largely by foreign capital inflows and oversized multi-year deals with an increasingly jubilant IMF. Nevertheless, this growth strategy carried a number of substantial disadvantages, foremost among them dependence on flighty and unpredictable foreign business, as well as growing dollar-denominated debts. Even more pressingly, the peso's dollarization merely papered over a long-standing practice among Argentine elites, the conversion of their domestic assets into offshore dollar-denominated assets. In other words, Argentina structurally weakened its fiscal powers through reliance on issuing dollar-denominated obligations over which it had no sovereignty, and weakened its powers of taxation through aiding capital offshoring. Second, Argentina effectively wiped any autonomy from their unit of account by pegging it to the US dollar, ensuring that they could not print a peso currency by sovereign fiat, or at least not print it in any way which would destabilize exchange rates. Nevertheless, the Argentine state successfully navigated the economy through two severe economic shocks in 1994 and 1999, each caused by financial contamination from larger trading partners. By 2000, however, the situation was different. In the 1999 presidential elections, term-limited President Menem's Peronist-oriented party fractured as the party's new candidate, Eduardo Dualde, called for open renegotiation of the country's foreign debt and promised a reversal of course compared to Menem's relentless liberalization. Such divisions paved the way for Dualde's pro-market rival Fernando de la Rúa to win the presidency. But de la Rúa's fragile legislative alliance did not win a majority in Congress, and were additionally beset with deep internal fractures over liberalization, as well as a revolving door of resignations and a deep national unpopularity. This unpopularity only grew during 2000 and 2001, when a number of severe austerity measures were taken that, as one economist put it, would have been very hard to swallow in most democratic societies. Specifically, these austerity measures consisted of large tax increases, government spending cuts, and attacks on labor rights. Argentina received assistance from the IMF to maintain government liquidity, but quickly lost credibility in the face of the IMF's troublingly unrealistic growth projections. The revolving door of scandals, resignations, and a devastating midterm loss during 2000 as well as the politically motivated firing of the central bank governor, made the situation much worse. government efforts to restore confidence focused most centrally on deficit reduction, capital controls, and bank freezes, which they used as legitimation to strike increasingly desperate deals with the IMF and international partner countries for aid. Thus, the traditional story told about this government response is that it was too little, too late, and that this crisis could have been averted through essentially what amounts to even deeper and earlier austerity measures. In my paper project, I spent a long time presenting and contesting the orthodox economic reading of this stylized narrative. But here I want to present two clusters of evidence, which I do not think that this traditional story can easily explain, and show how the expectational power perspective buys us a better vantage point. In brief, the two clusters are the unexpected response of markets to austerity and the forgotten role of regionally backed secondary currencies and contesting the peso as a central unit of account. The structures of Argentine economic governance are fairly unique in that for contingent historical and political reasons, the country is quite decentralized. The central government is responsible for the vast majority of taxation efforts, which it funnels to provinces who actually control spending. In partial modification of this system, the federal Argentine government formed a landmark agreement with the provinces in 1996 to form a Provincial Development Trust Fund, the FFDP. The FFDP dispersed funds to provinces, but also aimed to enforce privatization of state enterprises, increase the agility and flexibility of provincial bureaucracies, and aid in the quote-unquote sanitizing of provincial debts via renegotiation, restructuring, or cancellation. This language of sanitization lent an explicitly moral valence to the project of governing via debt. The provinces, and to a lesser extent the central government, were thus cast as having unclean finances, which needed to be scrubbed through a disciplined effort at reorganization, which would make economic governance legible and credible to market investors. Thus, when the economic crisis during 2000 began to really hit the fan, this sanitization logic was radicalized through the implementation of a strict zero-deficit government spending policy, enacted in part by shuttering the usual flow of funds to provinces. This measure was aimed at showcasing Argentina's hardline commitment to fiscal discipline at all costs, prioritizing anti-debt ideology over normal governance. Judged by its own goals, this measure was ambiguously successful. The already fairly modest national fiscal imbalance was corrected during the second quarter of 2001, and the national debt decreased. However, this policy was not remotely successful in restoring market confidence. This can be seen from the Emerging Market Bond Index data, which is a measure maintained by JP Morgan to track the spread between the sale of US Treasuries and the government bonds in emerging markets. Every 100 basis points in the EMBI represents an equivalent percentage of annual interest and additional risk as compared to US bonds. As the figure shows, the July 10 zero deficit announcement resulted in an extraordinary 25% jump to the perceived risk of Argentine bonds. This was a head scratcher for orthodox economists who turned to explanations about signaling and hidden information. But here the traditional story reaches its limits. Obviously, austerity commitments did not restore market confidence. And the reason is ultimately common sense. The austerity measures worsened the domestic political crisis, constrained the state's ability to issue currency and thereby to coordinate behavior, and curtailed the expectational power of the state. The secondary evidentiary cluster I want to present is about the rather curious proliferation of alternative currencies to the peso, backed by regional governments within Argentina. Recall that as part of the debt sanitization efforts, the federal government began withholding the tax sharing obligations from provinces that it had even previously agreed to, in part because of its own increasing perceived insolvency, and in part as a tool to encourage fiscal discipline. In this context, both the federal bureaucracy and the province of Buenos Aires specifically attempted to create new instruments which could allow them to, at least in name, simultaneously meet their contradictory commitments to austerity, tax sharing, and to ordinary fiscal governance. In July 2001, Buenos Aires declared a state of emergency and authorized the issue of treasury bills, quote, for the cancellation of obligations, officially nicknamed patacones. In August, the federal government followed suit and issued their own instruments for the cancellation of obligations, abbreviated LECOPs. And here you can see printed versions which were distributed. By October, a variety of other provinces attempted to emulate the emergently successful model of patacones and LECOPs, issuing their own bills and bonds as a means of debt cancellation. In total, 10 provinces issued enough quasi-money bills to be seen as problematic during the crisis recovery period in 2003, when the federal government launched a quote-unquote monetary unification initiative. Even at this late date, nearly a year and a half after the peak of the liquidity crisis, these secondary currencies made up nearly a quarter of the national money supply. The nature and social meaning of these new forms of obligation evolved over time. Patacones and lecapes were always the largest secondary currencies, and as this chart shows, made up by themselves an extremely significant share of the money supply, despite being regionally bounded. Patacones were understood upon initial issuance in summer of 2001 as secondary peso-denominated obligations, i.e. an IOU from a part of the government to pay real pesos upon a later date. This is the basic unproblematic structure of many ordinary government instruments, including bonds. But from the beginning, these new instruments acted differently than normal bonds. The primary purpose of these instruments from inception was to substitute for pesos as a means of payment. Within a matter of months, patacones would be used as a provincial means of payment for all kinds of obligations, including the salaries of teachers and state companies, the payment of retirement benefits and social security benefits, and the fulfillment of monetary damages arising from judicial cases. By February 2002, over 80% of retirement benefits in Buenos Aires were paid in patacones. Money users quickly learned that these instruments were not ordinary bonds, and that the instruments therefore quickly broke free of narrow usage for discharging debts to the government and public companies, and instead gaining purely private channels of circulation. For instance, in December 2001, one business association survey found that 65% of its membership in Buenos Aires accepted customer payment in patacones or lecapes. Also, the 80 McDonald's locations in Buenos Aires, for instance, began offering quote-unquote patacombo deals, consisting of 2 cheeseburgers, fries, and a soda for 5 patacones in exact change. That winter, advertisements show that private traders bought and sold patacones for between 91 and 97 peso cents, i.e. a 3 to 9% discount over the peso. For our purposes, I want to argue that the forgotten rise of these secondary currencies is not easily explicable under a framework which understands financial crisis only as the rational reaction of financial investors to government profligacy. Instead, I understand the rise of secondary currencies as the last stop in the unwinding of fictional expectations, i.e. the contestation of conceivable expectations, and a change in the very imagination and units by which actors could commensurate the world. By way of conclusion, I would just end with the following. First, I have proposed here a general concept, expectational power, which describes the multi-level interaction between the formation of economic meanings and actual behaviors. Second, expectational power helps us supersede a narrow orthodox economic framework to understand financial governance as maintaining the expectations which power the entire system of money, but also open money up to political contestation by its very nature. Thus, I propose a re-understanding of liquidity crises, at least in the Argentine context, as an authentically political outcome, kick-started by the process of austerity. Most certainly, more fiscal discipline would not have averted the crisis in Argentina. Thank you.
Thank you for the paper, Jack. Please hold on to your questions for Jack for the Q&A session. Next, we have James, who's going to be presenting a paper titled Financialized Farmland.
Thanks very much. So thanks for the opportunity to speak with you all today. I am here to talk about a project with my University of Nebraska colleague, my old institution, Jess Shoemaker. Would you believe that I got interested in the project of financialized farmland while I was teaching at Nebraska? So our project is about the profound transformations that are occurring in how land, a basic and essential resource, is being integrated into the modern capitalist economy. And this project has a lot of, or picks up on a lot of the themes, like Paul's work in the first panel, right? The problem that we describe is known to folks in this room, to scholars in sociology, political science, geography, agricultural economics, less so to scholars in my field, law, and in particularly securities law. And recent trends in land ownership and global land grab dynamics, we think portend significant structural changes to the distribution of ownership and thus of economic and political power across rural America. So just to talk about what's happening in farmland, right? Traditionally, you might have an image of this is the top Google image search result for family farmer. And traditionally, farmland was owned and operated by those who lived on it, fostering a sense of, or at least in theory, under a yeoman Jeffersonian vision of agrarian democracy, fostering a sense of stewardship rooted in community and sustainability. But today, we're witnessing an unsettling trend. The financialization of farmland, or if you prefer, as my colleague does, the kind of privatization of the countryside. And this idyllic image of family farms and our longstanding public policy commitments to, or at least aspirations to organize production and social provisioning in rural America around small-scale yeoman-type family farms rather than big-scale agricultural firms. That's being overshadowed now by the rise of large agricultural corporations and in particular absentee landlords, which, for why we're here in the room today, a resurgence of feudal-like structures where relatively few control vital resources and many are left dependent and disenfranchised. And so companies and financial investors, are increasingly treating land purely as an asset or asset class, as a tool for generating financial return, potentially, in some cases, stripping away intrinsic value and disconnecting from the fundamental purposes of providing rural lives and food systems sustainably. We'll get to why in just a moment. But this financialization that I'm referring to has led to a new kind of landlordism, modern rentiers who collect income from the ownership of productive agricultural land across the United States and, in fact, around the globe without necessarily contributing to production themselves. So according to USDA data, 40% of US farmland is rented out, totaling at least $30 billion in annual rental payments on at least $1 trillion of land assets. And up here on the slide reflects, some asset values and land under management for a number of institutional investors. So this detachment raises, in my view, some serious concerns about the rise of a neo-feudal system where wealth and power are concentrated in the hands of a few who control essential resources. And this system echoes, some historical feudal structures, but in the guise of corporate entities and investment vehicles. And in this context, or at least I'm referring to a return to systems of economic and social relations where land and capital accumulation by a few dictate the livelihoods of the many. And this is not just kind of a matter of economics, it's a matter of power. So grass tax, what does this look like? Acre Trader is a website that is one of the kind of packagers of financialized farmland deals. They are a vertically integrated firm that has a broker-dealer as well as an investment management firm, and they'll buy a firm. We'll talk about why in just a moment. Buy a land. This is 237 acres in Lee County, Illinois, and they're doing a $2.8 million equity raise. They're going to create an LLC out of it and sell off interests in that LLC to pensions, endowments, institutional investors of the sort that Paul was talking about. And so financialization, this idea that we need to turn more asset classes into things that can be colonized, has exacerbated these trends, turning land into a commodity to be traded, to be fractionalized in the manner that I'm describing, not as a resource for creating community or sustenance. So platforms like Acre Trader, I claim, symbolize this shift where land is pieced into investment portfolios, detached from realities of soil and toil. And the problem, of course, is that finance can't leave well enough alone. It's looking for new asset classes to colonize. Now, I should say the presence of finance in rural America is not necessarily bad. Credit is often seen as the lifeblood of an economy. And in some sense, we also struggle with the problem of adequate equity financing, people putting in their own money to be able to have ownership stakes in American farmland. Finance has entered the land market in rural America, partly responding to the problem of demand for exit. In an age when no one young really wants to live in rural places anymore, and if you are land rich and cash poor, and if you don't have an heir who will take over as a local operator, what do? You need to exit your investment to be able to fund your retirement. So your options from the top are to, sell to someone local, keep it in the family, perhaps owned by a suburban heir who rents it out to the nearby farmer who wants to get the returns to scale on fixed costs of agricultural production by leasing out more land that you can produce, right? The third option really is this acre trader option, selling out to a private equity packager that then creates a business entity form that can get fractionalized, sliced and diced, and sold in global financial markets. So this detachment that I'm describing leads to potentially a cascade of effects in rural areas. As land becomes, excuse me, increasingly a plaything for distant investors, local farmers struggle to compete. Community cohesion erodes, and as we'll see in a moment, ecological sustainability takes a back seat to short-term profits. And as rural communities face the impact of this shift, we see a particular pattern emerge in that local farmers are squeezed out by high land prices, communities keep losing their young people to cities, new entrants don't have access to the land that they need to begin farming. Meanwhile, as I mentioned, ecological practices can also give way to industrial farming methods that degrade the soil as well as biodiversity. And the connection between the people and the land that they farm or the land that they live on, raise families on, weakens. And that weakened connection, we claim, threatens the integrity of local food systems as well as the cultures that are built around them. So I think there are many reasons for this trend. One obvious place to begin is the American narrative that has been deeply intertwined with land, from the displacement of indigenous peoples to the Homestead Act's promises. And each phase of this history is not only kind of redefining the natural landscape, but also the socioeconomic structure of rural America and of agricultural production in these places. And this lays something of a foundation for today's challenges. A second reason for this trend, we suggest, is kind of neoliberal attitudes and the rise of what we call the Burl means farm. So neoliberalism expands the scope of market-based mechanisms in the allocation of resources. And the ideological hegemony of this market-oriented vision has been ushered along by the century-long rise, evolution, and dominance of a particular mode of organization in which ownership and control are separated in the modern firm. And so two law professors, basically 90 years ago, accounted for this fundamental shift in the organization of economic enterprise from a traditional model in which ownership and control were, aligned, closely held by a few individuals, to something that had shifted by the 1930s to a dispersed model where ownership was more spread out. The kind of end point of this is the passive investment that we've been talking about today. But this contribution to corporate law scholarship of the Burl means firm is hard to overstate. Corporate law scholarship today is now primarily concerned with addressing concerns of the type that they articulated about the separation of ownership and control and the principal agent or agency cost problems that arise as a result of this separation, right? Professional corporate managers having conflicts of interest that will arise naturally by the fact that when we ask people to do things for us, everyone's interests differ. And in this case, when you have differing interests with other owners in running the company, that's a major focal point of corporate law scholarship these days. And the rise of dispersed absentee-owned farmland as a substitute for the same kind of dispersed ownership firm that we've seen rising up over the last 100 years or so, has mirrored, or I should say, they have mirrored each other. And in our view, this did not happen in a vacuum. It occurred along with other choices that have shaped markets as well as the distribution of entitlements to property. And this legal framework facilitates the accumulation and transfer of property rights in a way that facilitate or prioritize economic efficiency and investment over perhaps traditional models of stewardship or land tenure or community-based management, alternative visions of how we can organize agricultural land tenure. So a property-based conception of corporate law might illuminate some of the ways in which legal frameworks govern the accumulation, use, and distribution of resources, and by treating business entities as bundles of assets, including property owned by shareholders or, LLC members, pensions, endowments, things of that nature. Corporate law and unincorporated entity law parallel the turn in property law to treat land as a divisible, transferable commodity. More broadly, under the neoliberal policy consensus that has prevailed since, broadly the 1970s, corporations have grown in size and power, as have asset managers. And this has been facilitated by kind of weakened regulatory constraints and enhanced capacity for capital to move out of jurisdictions that are perceived to be unfriendly to it. And so this, pro-business environment has allowed corporations, asset managers to increasingly influence economic and political agendas, aligning them with market-driven principles that prioritize efficiency and profit maximization over perhaps broader communitarian goals. And let me suggest to you that this was not always, foreordained. What if I told you that Iowa Senator Chuck Grassley was a leader in the 1970s of a revolt against asset managers coming into the American heartland? Congress had hearings in 1977, which essentially forced a large asset manager to abandon its first plans to create essentially a farmland fund, with widespread criticism from politicians across the kind of agricultural heartland, saying that this was going to efforts to privately place interests in farmland to institutional investors were going to be a fundamental threat to rural livelihoods and ways of living. So what happened with that moment? Among other things, rural communities lost that particular movement after the farm crisis of the 1980s, which kind of was ushered along in the path to neoliberalism. I suggest that this is also related to the decline of the prairie populist form of politics and organizing in the agricultural heartland, and the rise of kind of a more business aligned Republican Party in many states. So that doesn't mean, however, that these movements have gone away, right? I suggest that there are three key social movements that have brought about regulatory, or that have pressured regulatory intervention in this space. The first relates to a movement in the 1970s to deal with corporate farming. The perceived problem with corporate farms was the shield of limited liability that comes with the corporate form. If your business, spins off externalities, you pollute, and the cost of pollution is more than the cost of or the kind of assets of your business, then you might, without the shield of limited liability, you might have to pay in to fund those business losses. And so the concern was that folks who are non-adjusting creditors, people who aren't entering into contracts, tort creditors in the world, they are just, they have to deal with limited liability firms. And in rural places, people did not like that. There was a concern about corporate land ownership versus concentration. And these laws ultimately, didn't work out because of legal challenges, mostly from the business community, and mainly because challenges not to restrictions on corporate entities owning farmland themselves, but rather to carve-outs that had been, put in these laws to exempt local, family-owned farms that wanted to own through a trust or a partnership or an LLC for otherwise legitimate seeming kind of entity, estate planning and tax planning purposes. More recently, we see a widespread consensus in many states against foreign ownership of farmland, primarily on claimed national security sensitivity grounds. And in many states, there are also concerns about tying up land for a very, very long time. All right, so in this context, I want to end my talk thinking about the role of financial regulation in both kind of creating this as well as the limits for what financial regulation, how it can be brought to bear. So traditionally, these regulations have been crafted to support capital formation, right? To make it easy. And let me take a step back. The reason why I'm talking about financial regulation is that scholars in many fields have come to say, if only there were some form of financial regulatory intervention that could solve this problem for us. And as a former financial regulatory attorney, I'm here to pour some cold water on that idea, right? So these regulations, or I should say the securities laws, have a fundamental capital formation policy driving them, which is to make it easier and more attractive to invest money. And so while these policies have succeeded in mobilizing capital, they've also prioritized financial growth at the expense of other critical values like equity, sustainability, community resilience. So can financial regulation itself save us from these dynamics? It's clear that things like enhanced disclosure requirements, for example, for private equity firms that have kind of similar market caps, public companies, strengthened investment advisor regulations, or under some more ambitious visions of securities regulation, what's known in state law as a merit-based review of financial practices could mitigate some harms. But ultimately, these are fundamentally reactive measures, right? They're designed to make markets function more transparently and efficiency toward that end of increasing returns on investment. And there's nothing about that that form of intervention that means we're going to trade off that drive to maximize profit in order to achieve kind of broader social or environmental concerns. So for instance, I liked Paul's suggestion in the first panel about bringing asset managers under greater democratic control. My own vision of that is something more akin to the self-regulatory organization model like we have with the stock exchanges. Though the trouble, in my view, is how to navigate a transition that deals with kind of wresting control from incumbents of their power in the case of asset managers, or their wealth in the case of like a Georgia land tax. But I think that brings us to a crucial point, right? That if we're going to address the challenges posed by new land rentiers and the broader implications of financialized capitalism, perhaps mere regulatory tweaks will not be enough, right? Perhaps in this line of thinking, if financialized, or I should say, if financial regulatory interventions are not going to be enough, we might need more transformative reforms that reimagine our relationship to land and capital, which might involve revisiting who owns farmland and how it's managed, fostering more cooperative or community-based models of land stewardship. And prioritizing kind of more sustainable practices. Not to get into the very thorny issue of theories of change, but in seeking solutions, I turn to the visionary work of Eric Olin Wright and his concept of real utopias, advocating for transformative reforms that kind of reconstruct or move us away from societal or reconstruct societal institutions in ways that prioritize human flourishing over profit. And I'm not sure what this would mean, but perhaps fostering arrangements that promote access to land for those who farm it, support ecological sustainability, and the like. This might not be there. Punchline to this is our planet got destroyed, but for a short time, we created a lot of shareholder value. So these changes require, I think, a shift in our socioeconomic structures. We have to challenge that dominant capitalist narrative that land is merely an asset to be exploited for maximum profit. And in this vision, we might see land as a community resource vital to survival and well-being. I will say, was that my last slide? No. I'm not sure this portends well for the future of capitalism because it becomes increasingly clear that relying solely on financial regulation to constrain finance is not going to be sufficient. And so I suggest we might need more deeper systemic changes that looks, in addition, at spatial justice demands about how we address inequities in the distribution of ownership in farmland. So I think this compels us to consider not only who owns the land, but how this affects the distribution of resources and opportunities across communities. Thank you very much.
Thank you, James. Our last presenter for this panel is Adrián.
Well, we can start. My presentation is about Veblen. and how can be related some analytical contribution from Veblen to the features of neo-feudalism. This presentation was motivated by my study, my reading of Veblen 4 years ago. And when I saw the where can oh,
Sorry about that.
when I saw the
I just need to.
the color paper of this conference, I noticed some topics that related what I have read about Veblen. Well, first, thank you for the invitation. When in the call of paper, I read some topics. I found some topics that can be related to Veblen. I was not familiar with the neo-feudalism literature, so I go into the literature and try to mix what Veblen could say about it. I have to say that Veblen was teaching in this hall, maybe, in between 1892 and 1986, about 120 years ago. He was walking around. He followed this series of positions in this university. He was also the editor of the journal, the first editor of the Journal of Political Economy. And along with Veblen in these halls was John Dewey, Jacques Loeb, William McDougall, and William Thomas. Also, Veblen learned from William James, Charles Peirce, Richard Ely, James Clark, some of the best economic and social thinkers in America in the end of 19th century, in early 20th century. I visit this university in 1992. Maybe you were born yet. I was studying here in Indiana, in Notre Dame, and I visited the university in 1992, and I found an exhibition about Veblen at that time. Veblen has a current interest in the literature. I found some books, recent books. For instance, this 2018 book from Murray Murphy, a professor. He was a professor emeritus of American Civilization at the University of Pennsylvania, and he offers a interpretation of about what Thorstein Veblen thought. I also found this book in 2019. It's in French. Somebody talked about Jacques Legoff. This is Alice Legoff. It's a very good book for introduction to Thorstein Veblen. And also I found this book is from Professor Charles Camin, professor from Northern University, Northwestern, the neighbor is your neighbor here. And he is a very definitive intellectual biography of Charles Camic, of Veblen by Charles Camic, professor in Northwestern University. From that book, they say Camic helped us understand the historical roots and continued reach of Veblen, serial analysis of the sclerosis of the American souls. Also, the book of Jonathan Levy, he's a professor, he's here, about the age of American capitalism, is related somehow to Veblen. He said that in his opinion, what has been missing in the history of the American capitalism is an engagement with economics. He refers some thinkers like Keynes, Veblen, Schumpeter, and so on. I think there is more Veblen than others, but John Levy can say that. I tried to find where if Veblen is in the literature of the origin of neo-feudalism. I found that in general on neo-feudalism they refer Habermas, Wallerstein as origins of the literatures. I tried to look for Veblen in another places on neo-feudalism. I look out in the literature on techno-feudalism, digital feudalism, information feudalism, and in other authors that refer to feudalist concept. I found some reference of Veblen in Wolfgang Strick. He refers some parts of the theory of leisure class in his book. And also according to Mozorov, regarding the concept of techno-feudalism in Durand, there are many references on Veblen's analysis of predations. Also in Cecilia Ricard, in his intellectual monopoly capitalism, there are many references of Veblen, mainly related with the analysis of predation. And there is a huge literature on the capital as power previous to neo-feudalism. There is Veblen is part of this literature. Okay, let me very briefly review some foundational ideas in Veblen, and then develop three contributions to the concept of neo-feudalism from Veblen, Science Veblen. The feudalism was part of the barbarian area on the nature of capital and absentee ownership. Veblen can be referred as an study in the evolution of economic institution. In the literature, there are two perspectives in order to study Veblen. For some of them, Veblen is the creator of new system of theory, and for others, is a playful hit. He has a plentiful hints and insights, many of which are brilliant, several contradictory. This is who say this is a theoretical system. In the folklore of economists, Veblen has been variably, well, you can read better than me, this definition or this identification, labeling of Veblen. And for Anderson, he is the creator of new system of theory. Hudson, who is an expert in Veblen, just say he has plenty of hints and insights. One of my underlying points of this paper is that Hudson's perspective is more pragmatic. I mean, it's hard to find a system of theory in Veblen, but he has plenty of insights. Veblen understands the economy or the society as a complex of habits of thought, such as consumption based on emulation, business and industry, the machinera, monetary economic based on credit and financial innovation, absentee ownership, economic instability. One of the problems to understand Veblen is his own definition of institution. Is not a current definition, but he defines institution as complex of habits of thought. Veblen has a different psychology regarding to the previous neoclassical economics. He has a psychology based on instinct and different points from anthropology and evolutionary biology. In the biography of Kamik, he relates all this in how this connection happened here in Chicago. So there is basic instincts according to Veblen. Veblen say, following William James and Charles Dewey, people are active agents, and instincts are the innate innate, well, you can read. There are different kind of instincts and Veblens following Jacques Love and William McDonnell, also professors here in Chicago. The instinct of workmanship, the parental bent, is that those are the instincts which are grouped regarding highly curiosity, and the instincts propensities, sorry, in Spanish, which are disastrous for the group. Predatory instincts, propensity of emulation, individuous emulation, and self-regarding instinct. For instance, Veblen say that the propensity for emulation is an Asian, well, you can read better than me. From the instant, in the instance, there are habits there who which is the way to solve, to attend the instance, and the complex of habits create the institutions. The fact is, according to Veblen, that behavior at any given time is mostly a matter of habit and conventions. In that sense, they are institutional. The result is, well, you can read, I'm sorry, because my English. So there is a habits, instincts, institutions, technological change. This is the main part of the development of the theory of the perspective in Veblen. Institutions, instincts, technology, ownership, environmental conditions, habit of thinking, habits of behavior are the formal elements in terms of which all the causal relations are drawn up. Veblen's theory is a theory of evolution of economic institutions. Basic notions are three. Is behavior governed by instincts? Behavior is guided more proximally by institution, and institutions are in continual change. As I said before, when I talk about institution, is how Veblen defined them. Veblen, in some part, defined the evolution of the civilization according to different age. He's the anthropology of that time. The savagery, where the workmanship instinct predominate, the barbarism, where predatoristic predominate, the handcraft, where workmanship instinct is more prevalent than the predators, and predator instinct, and the machine era, that's the current era in the early 20th century. The predator instincts are more important, relevant than the workmanship instinct. In the book of Professor Levy, they talk about age. I don't know if it's a kind of related to Veblen's era. Veblen age. The barbarian era embraced the centuries from early half of the Neolithic period to about the Middle Age. I mean, in the superior part of the barbarism era is the Middle Age, the feudal society. According to Veblen, in the feudal or barbarian era, environmental conditions of war plus an accumulation of wealth induce the habit of thinking in terms of status and stimulate motive of self-interest. For Veblen, in the barbarian area can be recapitulated in the institution of ownership. There was a root motive of self-interest in acquisitive purpose and others. Moreover, Veblen is positive in repudiating the view that the ownership grew up of the storing up of individual or super products, and he's emphatic in pointing out to predatory exploitation as the root of from which ownership did grow. So for Veblen, these changes are carried in the current area, the machine area, as I argue that also it may be related to Neo-Feudalism. This is an reference where for Veblen, the habits of the barbarian era are continuous in the capitalism and maybe in the new feudalism. Here's a quote of Veblen, where he say that history records more frequent and more spectacular instance of the triumph of the imbecile institutions of life and culture. I mean, these imbecile institutions keep alive along the different eras. This is an example. For instance, the professor Sidney Plotkin, he relate how through Veblen can understand the case of Donald Trump. No? He say, using Veblen's theory of American development to explore the nation's curious fusion of barbarism and liberal democracy, and he tried to explain the Trump phenomena. So if Veblen was here, I think he was no surprised that we call the features that we relate to neo-feudalism persist. I mean, he will say, well, what are you expecting? In another part of the Veblen literature, there is explanation about the nature of capital, and he differentiate between tangible and intangible capital across different age of capital. In modern practice, Veblen defines tangible assets as the capital goods, but also he defined intangible assets that are those which contribute to the value of capital because they capitalize such habit of life of a non-technological character settled by, well, you can read where it's about intangible assets. Intangible assets are referred as a goodwill in business term, power, sabotage, monopolies, it's everything that allows business firm to obtain an income not related to capital goods. I have a kind of cartoon try to identify this. Try to illustrate this idea. Yeah. The state of industrial art is the communal set of knowledge of land, nature, people who make possible the production, and the business firms capture this production through tangible capital and intangible capital. Intangible capital, as I said before, is the goodwill, sabotage, power. It's everything that is not related to capital good, but allowed to obtain an income. From those incomes, including rent from the exploitation of intangible capital, and allows to capitalists to conspicuous consumption and financial speculation. This is another cartoon about where I try to illustrate the proportion, the share of earned income between tangible and intangible capital across age or eras. In the first one, in my left, is the late barbarian age, the medieval times, from Veblen. And then there's the age of capital. I use the term from Professor Levy. You see in the age of capital, the tangible, the income that can be obtained from the tangible capital is greater. And it's even greater in the age of control, also defined by in the Professor Levy's book, and the Neo-Feudalism. I mean, we try to say that this share of earned income explain the medieval time, the feudal times, and the neo-feudal times. No. From here, it's easy to go to the idea of absentee owners, as you mentioned, related to Veblen and Mintz, but it's also from Veblen. That I am not going to deal with, because I think it's quite obvious the relation between neo-feudalism and absentee ownership. I expect to be clear about the contribution of Veblen in the concept of neo-feudalism and the relevance to keeping reading Veblen in our current times, and more here in University of Chicago. Thank you.
Thank you, Adrian. We'll now open it up to our Q&A session. Yes, Jonathan.
So thank you. So first, just the comment for Jack, like expectational power sounds like a very, rich and exciting kind of analytical category. So I was glad to see that come up. I guess my question is for James. I mean, thinking of Veblen and hearing your presentation, which was very, kind of shocking, quite frankly, not knowing, the extent of the transformation you're describing, and thinking about how to characterize it. And on the one hand, it seems like, a new frontier for ever more commodification, in the Polanyi sense, sounds right. So I'm not suggesting that's wrong, but kind of thinking of the longer history of agriculture and land as a commodity in the United States, as you say, the kind of Jeffersonian yeoman myth has been a myth, for a very long time now. So thinking about how to kind of characterize what's new in this moment versus kind of previous chapters in the history of commodification, like predation might be the right word. That there's something about this that's much more predatory than kind of previous instances of the capitalist transformation of the countryside. And so I was just kind of curious how you would kind of react to that characterization, and also wondering, we do have, in terms of legal regulation, a notion at least of predatory lending that does some kind of legal work. And so I was just thinking about the possibility of predatory investing being a kind of meaningful category that could maybe perhaps somehow get traction, in a legal or regulatory sense.
Great, thanks very much. So let me start by saying I'm not a Veblen expert. So with that caveat, that what strikes me as new about the commodification of land compared to older practices of land speculation, it reflects something kind of like the hustle culture point that we were talking about in the first panel, right? The original agrarian vision of, go move out to, unoccupied land, break it, clear it yourself, homestead. That is all a very kind of use your own labor to create sweat equity and ownership vision of, an entrepreneurial vision of self and of how you build value. And what I suggest is that this has changed to something where now people don't see, or I should say, the owners of farmland who don't have to sell unless they need a liquidity event or something, or unless they have no heirs. They now see
the value of farmland as being a component of a diversified portfolio, right? So it's one plank of a portfolio that you want to diversify away from in order to, have a productive and easy retirement or whatever. And without demand pressure from people with both the capitalization and the desire to become farmers themselves and follow in those agrarian footsteps, the only pool of potential buyers that's left is the financial firms that are selling this same vision, not of, hey, be a farmer, build sweat equity for yourself, but hey, own a slice of like a well-diversified, good on the risk reward, efficient frontier kind of asset. So I do think that is a kind of transformation. I am skeptical that financial regulation, on your last point, will solve the problem of predatory investing. I do think that you would need to have probably some external shackles to that. But to your first point, I think that's also probably a vein rich for kind of mining for further content.
My question is also for James. So if there are other people that have questions for the other speakers, maybe we could take them first. I don't know. I don't want to monopolize.
I think you can go ahead and.
Okay, I'll go ahead. So it kind of follows up on what John was asking. So the best way I can start this question is by saying that the ownership of farmland by these types of investors just kind of feels wrong. There's something about farmland, much in the same way there's something about housing that feels like it shouldn't be owned by a Blackstone or a Brookfield or an entity like that. There's something very, there's a particular emotive element to it. With that said, one of the things that struck me, so I've read both of the books, the two main books on this, The Financialization of Farmland by Madeleine Fairbairn and Stefan Umer. And they're very good books, but one of the things that struck me about those books is that both of them are actually remarkably thin on kind of substantiating the argument, which both of them make, that this is a bad thing. And what I mean by that is there's very little evidence in either of those books about maladaptive outcomes resulting from farmland entering into not just in the US, but particularly in the US, entering into the ownership of these types of entities, which is kind of surprising, I think. And it really actually, and there's a big difference there between, for example, what's going on in housing, where there's actually now abundant evidence that the ownership of housing by the Blackstones of this world does result in much worse outcomes, not least in terms of evictions, than where housing is owned by other types of private sector actor, be that, bog standard property companies or even pension funds. And so I guess my question is, have you come across much evidence of deleterious outcomes, be they ecological in terms of kind of unsustainable farming practice, or sociological in terms of the impacts on local farming communities from the transition to this type of ownership? Or are we still relying on the type of critique which I think Umer and Fairbairn's books ultimately represent, which is this kind of presumption that you have predatory outcomes?
So we're a bit shorter on time, so we'll take all the questions right now. Catherine, please go ahead.
Here.
So I have a question for Adrián, which is a criticism and an appreciation of Veblen. Veblen has been criticized for not really having a theory of labor. I really, really like, though, his theory of emulation, and there's an aspect of it that I would like you to comment on, because it provides a new frame for us to think about speculation. He talked about how emulation is related to the exploit, and under feudalism, the actual physical force of domination resulted in the exploit. He says hunting, or even in hunter-gatherer societies, the hunter had the most prestige. And he said there's this sort of routine everyday labor that's degraded in this culture of emulation, which I think is very good way of thinking about like profit taking on the stock market. Like you have an exploit, and that's what hackers actually talk about in coding. Like when you do something great, it's called an exploit. But that exploit doesn't explain exploitation. So I want to just push back a little bit on Veblen as a social, as offering a totalizing social theory.
Do we have any more questions? Okay.
Yeah, it's a comment rather than a question, and I can't help making it. I recommend, among the other books that were recommended regarding Veblen, people also read David Reisman's short biography of Thorstein Veblen. That book came out at a time during the Keynesian consensus, as it will. It wasn't a consensus here at Chicago, but it was at the time when Reisman wrote it. And what it strikes me is that it indicates the oblivion into which, in the post-Keynesian era, Veblen, among others, who were intrigued by anything other than the neoliberal criteria, were jettisoned, were thrown into a memory hole. I can't help to mention that all the people who are Keynesians, by the way, were also Veblenites. John Kenneth Galbraith among the foremost of them. Just a key comment regarding that.
Any, can take one more question, but if not, I'll just read one question we have from Zoom. This is for James, and the question is, where does the creation of industrial farms fit into your narrative, and how does the universal ownership of the sort Paul describes complicate the picture of predation? TIAA, after all, invests on the behalf of many academics. So we can start with Adrián, if you, would you like to respond to?
Okay. Well, I think it is a debate about Marxism and Veblen. And as you point out, exploitation is missing in Veblen. But Veblen is looking on American capitalism, and it's, I think it's relevant for today, because today exploitation has been hidden in this mass of financial transactions. I mean, profit maybe in the origin came from the exploitation, but right now I'm not sure. I mean, I obtain firms obtain profits from financial, for doing business in another countries. I mean, we don't know. We don't know where the plus value came from, because it's a intertemporal process. I think so.
Great, thanks very much. So I was trying to organize all of my notes here. So one thing, just to take that first comment, I think there is fundamentally an epistemological or methodological problem with trying to, well, so the short answer is yes, there is evidence of like deleterious effects. There's lots of evidence about absentee owners in particular, leading to kind of higher higher rental rates, higher land prices, lower educational attainment of rural communities, right? There's a problem of correlation causation that I don't want to kind of disentangle here, but there is a pretty significant literature that those effects are probably implemented through a channel in which basically a channel of unpriced externalities that an absentee owner, especially one that has kind of fractionalized interest, is not going to care about the effects of not having that marginal neighbor being down the road who can add to community, who can know if there's something wrong, someone who, if you have a small boundary dispute, you can knock on their door, right? If it's someone who's an LLC in a post office box across the state, that sort of community effect is really hard. But I think there's also an epistemological or methodological problem related to answering that question, which is that the system by which land ownership and ownership transfer is recorded at what, in paper, in widespread county clerk offices around the country, not digitized, makes it really hard to answer that macro question of who owns the land. And so, from the perspective that values being able to do an econometrically robust difference in difference analysis between two states to figure out what the effect of an increase in the share of absentee financialized ownership, like that, just getting that data is really hard. The best stuff that I've seen does answer that sort of question, though. As to the question on Zoom about universal ownership, I do think it raises a lot of the broader agency problems of aligning the incentives of the beneficial owners of mutual funds, of the stakeholders in this room who care about the University of Chicago's endowment not for its financial returns, but for the fact that it allows us to keep the lights on and allows us to have like the nice croissants in this room, right? Thank you again to the organizers of this panel, right? So that sort of thing is really important to stakeholders, but they may beneficial holders of pension interests and things like that might have different preferences about how we mediate kind of structures and relations of economic production, because we might be downstream investors, but we are also consumers, we're also neighbors, community members, and have lots of varied interests. From that perspective, I think the universal ownership concept holds a fair amount of promise, in part because it aligns with what we think about in many fields as like the ideal social planner, right? Not just one firm in an economy, but if you abstract it away from one firm's particular interests, what would the ideal social planner do? And that's maybe, if we can get the governance arrangements right, maybe what we can do with universal ownership.
Thank you. A round of applause for our panel again. We'll just end it here.
Great, thanks. We'll have 1 hour for lunch. Sorry, lunch will be provided just outside, and we shall reconvene at 1:30 for the humanities panel. Thanks.